Welcome everyone to another episode of How to Make It Happen in Photoshop. In today's work, we're going to learn how to separate hair from the background of a photograph using a couple different methods. And starting off with this photograph here, we've got this fantastic hair against the background where when you look at it up nice and close, there's a lot of thin wispy hairs, and it's going to be an awful lot of hassle trying to select this. But I'm going to show you a couple different methods that are going to make this a whole lot easier. First one is we're going to start off with our object selection tool in the toolbar, and that shortcut is W. With the object selection tool selected, I'm going to go into the options bar and simply click the select subject button. When we click the select subject, it's going to automatically select the subject on the page for us. Didn't have to click on anything other than the object selection tool and then the select subject button. Once it went in and automatically selected the subject, we're going to click on the select and mask button and bring us into the select and mask dialog box. Here we have our properties panel on what we can do with seeing how well this selection has been done around the hair. Typically when you come into the select and mask, the opacity is going to be set at 50%, and the opacity is just simply the preview of what you're looking at. I like to set the opacity up to 100% because this is going to give me a more realistic looking result, with the background being the exact opposite color that I started with. If you have the opacity at 0, your image is going to look exactly the same as it was when you applied the select subject selection. So I set the opacity up high, which is going to give me a contrasted background, and now I can see how this looks. Now at first glance, it looks great, and you're like, wow, that looks awesome. I think I'm going to run with this. Now, we're going to talk about a couple things here, because we've got refine mode here, and they've gone in and they've put in a new couple of buttons here, object aware and color aware. So color aware, as you see when you hover over this, it's the best choice for simple backgrounds, which this particular object is. It's a very simple background with some good contrast in between the hair and the background. Object aware is going to be when you have a completely different background that's going to be much harder to select. Hover over the object aware, and this is going to be hair or fur that is going to be on a complex background. We're going to stick with color aware, and we have to answer our little dialog box here saying that it's got to re-render it when we switch the modes. So in this case, color aware is going to be the correct setting. Now we're going to go down to the radius. The radius is currently set at 0, and I'm going to up the radius, and as I up the radius, you'll see the hair seems to grow a little bit. Well, what is the radius doing? Well, the radius is actually setting the amount of pixels in the refinement area. Now, as we set the radius higher and higher, you're going to notice more and more hair starts to come available. And if you want virtually every strand of hair, you can keep upping the radius more and more. However, we're paying attention to just the hair here. One thing that I want to show you is this. I'm going to grab the zoom tool that's here on the left-hand side, and I'm going to zoom in to the face. And you can see when we set the radius starts to change the entire selection of the person. So while a higher radius may work very well for the hair, it's also controlling the rest of the selection around the entire person or the subject. And yes, while we're getting great hair out of this, it's also sacrificing the edges of everything else. So setting the radius very high will give you a very nice, clean, refined edge around the hair, but you're going to sacrifice the person. So how do we take care of that? Well, this is how we're going to do this. I'm going to cancel out of this select and mask, and I'm going to do my Command or Control D to deselect my selection. Now, with my rectangular marquee tool, I'm going to put a selection right over the top of his head. So basically including his hair, but not much else. And then I'm going to do a Command or Control J. And a Command or Control J is going to take that selected area and it's going to copy it and put it on its new layer. So this I'm simply going to call hair, and I'm going to name it hair 2. So I put a selection around the original layer, Command or Control J, duplicated that layer. I'm going to run my object or subject selection on this alone so that I'm not getting any selection on the original image. So back to my selection tool, back to my select subject on this layer, and it gives me the hair. Select the select and mask button, and then I can use the radius to define how I want my hair to look. And as I increase this radius, I see that it's doing a really good job of going in and selecting the hair and even the little bits in between. Once I'm happy with this, down at the bottom, generally output settings here are closed. I'm going to open the output settings area, choose output 2, and I'm going to say I want a new layer with the layer mask. Now you could say output to just a layer mask, which will mask this. I'm just going to output this to a new layer with a layer mask, which will copy this layer and apply a layer mask to it when I click OK. So this is my new layer with my layer mask, with just the hair. Now I can easily go back in to this hair area right here, and I can then select my subject and get a nice edge all around him without setting the radius. But we're going to focus on the hair for right now. So with this hair, it looks great because we're on a transparent background. I'm going to Command or Control click on the New Layer button at the bottom of the Layers panel, which will then put a layer below my selected object. If you simply click on the New Layer button, it will put it above your new layer. So Command or Control click on the New Layer button will give you a new layer below the layer that you're working with. And then this is going to be my color fill. I'm going to go to the color picker in my toolbar, and I'm going to pick a color. And then I'm going to use Option or Alt Delete to fill that background with the color that I chose. And there is my color. Now let's zoom in and see how this looks. Okay, this looks pretty believable. I mean, the hairs do tend to break up a little bit, but overall, I think this is looking really good. And I see a little bit of color coming through here from the original hair, which we can definitely fix. And overall, I think this did a pretty good job of being able to go in and select the hair without really having much issue. Now, this is a lighter color background. I'm going to show you what happens when we do a darker color background and what we run into. Back to the color picker, I'm now going to choose a darker background, and then back on my color layer, Option or Alt Delete, and it's going to fill it in with that darker color. Everything looks good on a light background because the hair was fairly light. Now with a darker background, we run into some issues. While these hairs have been very nicely selected in that Select and Mask section, you can see that the hairs are not translucent. So they still have color based in there, and so they show up on a dark background. And this can become a real tricky issue. So here's how we're going to solve this problem. I'm going to click on my hair, copy layer, and I'm going to add a new layer up above. And this is going to be my hair fill. With this hair fill, I'm going to click back on my hair, copy layer, choose eye, which is going to give me my eyedropper, and I'm going to sample the hair, and I'm going to do a little bit of painting on the hair fill layer. So I sample that color from the hair, and we're going to have to sample this hair color several times. And I'm going to grab my brush, which is the letter B, and right bracket is going to make my brush larger, left bracket will make my brush smaller. On the hair fill layer, I'm going to begin to paint just along the edge of my hair, just kind of touching the hair a little bit. Now this doesn't look good at all. So Coming back in between my hair fill layer and my hair copy, put your cursor in between those two layers. Hold down your Option or Alt key. You will get the box with a down arrow. Option or Alt click, and this will clip it directly to the layer down below. Now, any of the painting that we do on the hair fill layer, you'll see, will just simply fill in all of those pixels, and amazingly enough, it looks like a lot of them will simply disappear. Now, in order to get the hair to match, you will have to go back to your original layer and use your eyedropper tool and sample different colors. Go back to your hair fill and probably touch up some of these layers here, or some of these areas here, as you work to get this to fill in and make it look like hair. You will have to go back and forth. One thing that I like to do on this is painting is a little bit tricky because you get some kind of this blotchy effect. So what I like to do is the clone stamp tool. However, when I'm using the clone stamp tool, it's going to pick up all of the layers down below. So when I use my clone stamp tool, I usually select current layer and below. So when it chooses what to sample, it's going to sample my layer below plus the color layer. Well, I don't want to sample the color layer and put it into the hair because I'll probably end up changing this color layer. So I turn off the color layer. Now this makes it a little bit more tricky to work with because you're not seeing the contrast between the hair and the color layer. But I turn it off because I don't want to include it in my cloning. So I turn that off and go back to my hair fill, and I'm going to use my clone stamp tool, and then I Option or Alt sample, and with that I can Option click and I can begin to sample using the Option or Alt and paint the hair to get some more of that variation and those hair strands to come in at the ends. Now if I turn that color back on, you can see that that nicely blends in using the clone stamp tool. You want to stay pretty close to the edge because you don't want to start introducing blotchiness of color here in the hair, but you can see that it tends to pick up very nicely as you go around just the fine hair. I'm going to turn that color off. I'm going to come back in here and I'm just going to clone just the very ends as I come in here, trying to stay away from the main body of the hair like that. Don't want to clone his skin tone in there. And then come back and turn the color on, and you can see how that really cleans that up nicely. That's going to solve that problem. It takes a few minutes to go around, but then whatever color background you put on here, this will work fantastically. So this is going to be a really nice way to be able to go in and get the hair looking good. Zoom back out and you can see how nice that works. So this is one method, kind of more the automatic way. I'm going to show you another way of doing this by going back to the original hair, and I'm going to take all these and just simply put them into a group so we can go back to those if we ever wanted to. Method number 2, going in and using channels. Totally different way. This is not automatic. This is something that's going to require a little bit more time, but we'll show you how this works. Going back to the original image, turning off the other layers that we did, this is method number 2. I'm going to go into my channels panel, and I'm going to then click through my red, green, and blue channels. And I'm going to look for the channel that is going to give me the most contrast between the hair and the background. Generally, that's going to be the blue channel. Right-click on the blue channel and choose Duplicate Channel. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to select that blue copy and turn it on, and I'm going to turn off the visibility of my blue channel. You never want to work directly on your original red, green, or blue channels. You always want to copy. Here, this is going to give me the contrast between the background and the hair. I'm going to go in and I'm going to do a little bit of contrast work on this before I show you this nice method. So with my blue copy channel active and nothing else, I'm going to go under my image menu, under adjustments, and I'm going to choose levels, Command or Control L. With my levels panel, I'm going to bump up the highlights a little bit to lighten up the background. I'm going to bring my shadows in a bit to darken up those areas. And basically, I'm just concerned about getting darker hair and a lighter background. Okay, I don't want to go too far because the more I go, the more light that I put in by dragging the highlight slider in. I'm starting to drive the light and get rid of some of the hair. And then if I saturate too much, then the hair starts to get really thick. So I'm just going to bump up the highlights and the shadows here. Okay, not much, but just enough to give a little bit more contrast. Then I'm going to click OK. Now I'm going to go over to the Dodge and Burn tools. And Dodge and Burn are going to allow me to lighten or darken areas of this to basically give me the contrast that I'm looking for. And the reason why I want to get contrast is because in the end, I want to end up with just a black and white image. No tonal range in here, no highlights in the hair, literally just a black and white silhouette, which will then turn out to be my selection. When choosing the Dodge and Burn tools, Dodge is going to lighten, Burn is going to darken. So if I take my Dodge tool, because I'm going to start around the hair here and kind of get rid of the shadow, I take my Dodge tool, and to make my brush larger, I use my right bracket. Left bracket is going to make it smaller. And then I'm going to have to choose what range I'm working with here, whether I'm working in the shadow range, the midtone, or the highlight range. Well, here I'm working in the midtones because I've got this gray area here. And remember, I'm going in and I'm dodging, which is going to lighten. And so I'm going to lighten the midtones, and I'm going to come in here next to his hair. And I'm going to paint this in, and this takes a little bit of time. I'm going to get a large brush, and I'm just going to paint in with the Dodge tool and lighten that up. Now you'll notice that it's not really touching the hair, which is great because I'm using my midtones. If I use my shadows here, then it's going to start touching the hair. So I'm going to go with the midtones. I can probably go with the highlights too. Oh, the highlights are going to work even better. And you see when I paint with the highlights in here, it basically avoids all of the items that are black. Now, we will lose a little bit of detail in the hair here, but this will go, and it's almost like it's finding the edge of the hair without having to really pay attention to it, which is awesome. And you can see we have got a little bit of gray, a little bit of tonal range in the back there, which I want to get rid of. And I can paint and dodge around the hair here and really bring that hair out. I'm going to complete this kind of around the shoulders here as well. And I'm not really paying attention to the body because the body can be easily selected in other methods, using the pen tool, using the lasso tool, many different ways. All I'm really concerned with is the hair. So let me zoom in so we can see how well we've done with going in and dodging those areas. Now you'll notice I'm getting in here a little bit more, and I'm kind of cleaning up any of the areas that are a little bit soft or could be a little bit gray, and just kind of making sure that we get really good contrast in there, like that. Okay. The rest of this can be selected in different ways, but this is looking really good. Now I'm going to switch over to my Burn tool. Now my Burn tool is going to make things darker. So here I'm going to go in my shadows, and the reason why I'm going to do in my shadows is because the hair is very dark. And you can see when I begin to paint with a hair, I'm basically getting rid of all of those areas that are light because I don't want to be able to go in and select any white whatsoever. I want this to be total contrast, black and white. So as I go in and I paint these areas around the hair, this is going to allow me to kind of sharpen that hair and make it more distinctive, and getting rid of any of the highlights here, because anything that's light or white will end up being selected. Anything that's black won't be selected. So I want to make this as black as possible to get lots of contrast. Okay, there we go. Now, I can go over his face too and paint that all in. In fact, I'm going to select black as my color. So I'm going to get my solid black here and actually go in with my brush and then paint over all of this so that I don't worry about selection at all on his face, because all I want is black and white. So I go in and I paint everything on his hair so that the entire head of hair is going to be solid black and the background is going to be perfectly white. Nothing else. Okay. Now, I'm only doing his hair. The rest of his face we can select using manual selections. So here, if I don't want any of the little white spots, I'm going to paint those out. And this is my selection of his hair, right there. Now you may want to go in and kind of get rid of those little dots right there as well, and just paint those in like so. So this is my blue copy here. I know it looks kind of weird, okay? So here's what we have. Now, I think this looks pretty good. I've got good contrast here. I've got a little bit of gray in here. I think I'm going to go back in and I'm going to burn this area here just to give a little bit more contrast at the very edge here. Remember, the more contrast that you get, the tighter selection that you're going to get. I'm just going to burn those edges using my shadow right there. And there it is. Okay, now I go over to my blue copy and I'm going to Command or Control click, and I'm going to get a selection around that hair. Okay, now what happens was it selected everything that was black, and of course it left everything that was white. So now I'm going to click back on my composite channel, and I can see my entire selection right here, all around his hair. And I've turned off my blue channel just by selecting the composite. Make sure you select that composite, and then go back to your layers panel. So let's take a look and see what this looks like when we go into our select and mask. Now, one thing that I'm going to do is, I don't care about his face or his body right here, so I'm going to use my rectangular marquee tool, hold down my Option or Alt key, so I get the minus, and I'm simply going to draw a selection here and just deselect everything so that just his hair was selected, like we did in the first method. So there's the selection of the hair. Now we're going to jump into select and mask, and we're going to see how that worked. Okay, so that method worked really well. Okay, look at that. Look at that hair. See how nice that hair looks? Nice fine details in there, really clean. A little bit less ghostiness on the edge of the hair. And I think it looks pretty good. So I'm going to output this to a new layer with a mask, and then click OK, which is going to give me my duplicate one right here. Okay, and it looks great on a transparent background. I'm going to add a new layer underneath by Command or Control clicking on the new layer. I'm going to choose a color, so I'm going to go with a light color, and then on my layer I'm going to add the color using my Option or Alt delete. Once I set the name, Option or Alt delete, and that looks pretty good. Now, of course, if I choose a darker color, we're going to have a very different look when I Option or Alt delete that. So you can see there's less ghostiness here using the channels method. Now I would go through and do the same thing that I did with my other one. My other set that I did is I would put a new layer up above here, and this would be my hair color. And I would grab a brush, go back to my original hair layer, use my letter I to grab my eyedropper tool, sample a color of that hair, go to my brush, click on the hair color, and kind of paint that in along the edge. And you can set your opacity of your brush down so that you're not painting with solid color, and paint a little bit of color over the edge using a nice soft brush, large brush too, and paint with different colors. Go back to the original image, grab your eyedropper tool, maybe sample some different colors, back to the brush, paint in some of those areas, and then remember, you want to clip this hair color to this hair, Option or Alt, click in between the layers, and snap it right in. Looks pretty believable, doesn't it? If I continue painting here, remember you want to make sure that you match the color of the hair so that it doesn't look like it's too splotchy. I've chosen a pretty good medium tone, and now miraculously it's like we could go in and make it look like it never, ever, ever came out of a background. So interesting methods to go in and be able to work with hair selection. And I'm just going to finish it up here because this is looking really good, and make sure it all comes together really nicely. And now you can put this on any background, any place else, any image, any background, put it into any scene that you want, and it looks totally believable, just like that. And so a lot of different methods to be able to do this. These are the two methods that I use, and it's amazing how complicated it looks, but actually how easy it is, either using your object selection tool and then your select subject and then your select and mask, or going in and duplicating your blue channel, working on your blue channel with your dodge and burn, getting your selection, masking it, and then of course again going through your select and mask, and then of course clipping the hair color to the top of it is always something that you're going to need to do in order to get rid of those little flyaway, kind of softer gray but not translucent hairs. So I hope this was helpful for you, and go ahead and check out my other videos because there's always more fun to be had in Photoshop.